Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's the classic known as Jaws. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover a C for a classic, I for an indie, N for new, E for an egregious film, M for a masterpiece of a film, and A for an atypical film. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I'm Thomas here, the captain of the vessel known as the Orca, which is not just chasing bluegills and Tommy cats.
And I'm Bryan, and I'm certifiable, Quint. It's a great line in the movie.
Yes, for sure. But welcome everyone to the first ever episode of Cinema to the Letter. This is the former home of Double Edge Double Bill, and I decided to start this up with Bryan. Everybody, this is Bryan.
Hello.
His first time on the main feed. Patrons have already met him.
Yes.
Because he's special like that. He's special out there if you pay that $1. That'd be Bryan early. But welcome, Bryan, to the main feed. How's it feel being on a main feed of a podcast now?
Hi, yeah, it feels great. I'm super excited, especially to talk about a great movie today.
Yes. We'll be talking about a great film here. But you know what? We kind of explained this a bit in our intro that I prepared together. But given this is the first episode of the show, we should mention that this new show is a bit different than the former show that used to be on here. Basically, what our plan is, we're going to have 6-episode mini-series where we have a basic topic overall for the mini-series. In this case, the first mini-series is going to be about blockbusters. And during each of the 6 episodes, we're going to cover a movie that we feel kind of hits the criteria of the acronym for cinema. Classic, we're defining as pre-1980, even though as time looms ever further on, 1980 becomes more and more of a classic era, I suppose. But we just wanted to cover, some movies that were made before 1980 that would, not be in your Netflix algorithms and such. They're considered old, quote unquote. And then indie, we, decided on, a movie that was made for less than $10 million, didn't have much studio backing. And then N for new, we decided would be, something from, 2020 forward, basically, as roughly a new era, as you could say. Then the egregiouses are bad. We have to cover a bad, as we did on the former show. The M is for a more modern masterpiece, we determined, so 1980 through, 2019, as it were. And then the A for atypical, which would just be a weirder one, a more bizarre or underrated one. And we should mention, we've already picked out all the movies for this. We'll go ahead and give you the lineup. We're covering today the C for classic, which will be Jaws, which was partially picked by our patrons over at patreon.com/cinema2letter. Which is going to be our social media from here on, Cinema number 2 letter. Then for our I for Indie, next week we'll be covering the Blair Witch Project.
Yes.
Then the N for new is going to be Tenet, the Christopher Nolan very recent film, prior to, of course, Oppenheimer, which has not come out yet as of the time this is getting put out, but will be coming out soon. Then the E for egregious is going to be Van Helsing, the Stephen Sommers film. The more modern M for masterpiece is going to be Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And then our atypical, sort of weird, underrated one is going to be Last Action Hero.
Yes. It's a great lineup. It's a great starting lineup.
Yes, and we decided to do blockbusters because obviously this is coming out in the summer when we're premiering here. And I'm curious, Bryan, given, we're talking about the movie that many would argue is the creation of the summer blockbuster. What do you feel defines sort of a classic version of a blockbuster to you? When you think of classic blockbuster, not necessarily a specific title, but the kind of feeling that you get from that. Because we're two cynical film fans who aren't as especially kind to say the modern blockbuster era.
Yes.
Necessarily. But what do you think of when you think of a classic blockbuster?
It's funny because I was rewatching Jaws again today. It is just such a perfect kind of classic blockbuster. There's something about the movie that is like, it feels kind of small in a way, especially compared to movies today. But there's something interesting about the way that the kind of, for like, the classic thing is you don't see the shark for like 90% of the movie. Yeah, I don't know. There is something, I can't quite put my finger on it, but really like just classic feeling about this movie.
Well, I mean, in terms of like generally with like a classic blockbuster, to me, I agree with you. Like that the sort of limitations element is definitely there. Where like any sort of blockbuster, especially like before Jaws, there were big giant spectacle movies. They just didn't really come out specifically in the summer. If anything, they kind of waited till like near the end of the year, or would even go through like the roadshow process,
Right.
where they would be like, oh, hey, we're going to come out in early sort of screenings in July and then be in theaters all the way through like the next year, basically.
Yeah.
So we tour around the country with our 5 prints that we have. With like, the classic blockbuster, to me at least, it feels like movies that really want to convey that kind of grand spectacle, but do have limitation. I think that's definitely been a problem in the wake of like, sort of modern CG stuff. It's a common complaint of like, oh, when you can really do anything, quote unquote, it makes the spectacle feel a lot less heartfelt and soulful. And I think that's definitely a thing, especially in Jaws, where that was such a big problem with the production. They didn't end up being able to do like all the things they wanted, and that necessity is the mother of invention thing kicks in, which, we'll be talking about an indie movie where they had to deal with like very limited resources versus like even a classic movie. You can still see that like there are limitations to what you can do, especially in this older time period.
Yeah, and I mean, we should also, it is funny because this is a movie made by one of the greatest filmmakers of the past, many years, you want to say. I mean, you really get a sense for like how great, because this is his second movie, is that right? Spielberg.
I mean, yeah, if you don't want to count, like, there's a whole process, but this is his second theatrical film after
Right.
the Sugarland Express.
Sure.
Was the first one, yeah.
Yeah, but you get a really clear sense of how good Spielberg is as a filmmaker when he has to, deal with all of this, we'll talk about a bit of the behind the scenes stuff about the movie, but sort of my favorite part of this movie in a weird way is Spielberg's direction, which I know is kind of weird to say. So I'm kind of curious, actually. When did you first see Jaws? Did you see it pretty young?
Well, you know what? We'll get into this. Let's first play a bit of a clip from the trailer.
Oh, yes.
So here's a bit of the trailer for Jaws.
There is a creature alive today who has survived millions of years of evolution without change, without passion, and without logic. It lives to kill. A mindless eating machine. It will attack and devour anything. It is as if God created the devil and gave him jaws. Rated PG. Maybe too intense for younger children.
So yes, Jaws came out June 20th, 1975. Interesting, we're recording this June 21st.
Yeah.
So we're recording it like almost 48 years to the day.
Yeah.
When the movie originally came out.
I
in
like
theaters.
a few days ago, I kept seeing like anniversary tweets for Jaws, and I was like, oh my gosh, it also is just crazy to think that it's almost 50 years old at this point.
Yeah, it's crazy to think.
Yeah.
But Jaws, of course, like you were kind of teasing before we started playing the trailer here about like the relationship with Jaws, because obviously both of us were not around for 1975 when this movie came out. We're youngins in that way. But for me, Jaws, I remember very clearly, was a movie that one of many movies my father exposed me to at an early age. It wasn't probably the first Spielberg movie I watched. I think the first ones of those were like E.T. or the Indiana Jones movies.
Sure.
I probably watched before I watched Jaws. But Jaws was definitely one where he had us watch it at too young an age. I was 8, and I had like 2 younger sisters. So we weren't necessarily... And keep in mind, we lived in Florida.
Right.
So we went to the beach every summer.
Right.
And so this was like pretty early, I think, in the summer when I was 8 years old. And it's just like, hey, here's Jaws. all right, and then like in a week we're gonna go on a fucking beach vacation. I'm sure that'll be fun. Great, and we'll want to totally go in the water. But yeah, I just remember this definitely being an example of like, despite I became like a huge horror fan after a certain point, this is one of the early examples of I was a scaredy cat, but then eventually I had that fascination enough to like where I wanted to revisit some of these horror movies, and it got me into the horror genre. So it's kind of a gateway drug. It's weird given it is a PG-rated movie.
It is. I will say though, like there are some moments where I'm like, oh wow, this is violent. I mean, like immediately comes to mind is like Quint's death is like so violent.
Yes. Violent and just deeply upsetting as well. Just seeing that character go the way that he goes is like, oh, he's in like desperate clinging pain.
Yeah, and he's like
it's like this
screaming.
Really tough dude. Just like he's becoming like a screaming, wailing, pathetic child in death, as we all eventually will. But it's interesting. Yeah. But what about you? What's your relationship with Jaws? When did you first see it?
You know, it's interesting because I never saw it when I was young at all, and it was always like, you know, the kind of classic movie. Like, you know, you kind of I kind of knew of Jaws obviously through just like cultural osmosis and through like just so many parodies that, you know, movies and shows have done over the years. But I first saw it, I think I saw it when I was a teenager probably. And I don't think it was the first like Spielberg I ever saw. That I feel like the first Spielberg I saw was Jurassic Park. But I remember seeing it and just everything about it sort of immediately clicked as like, oh yeah, this is just a classic film. It's weird how familiar it feels to me, even though I've only seen it like once or twice. But it has become a movie that I absolutely love. I mean, just watching it today, I was like, this is a fantastic movie.
I mean, yeah, this definitely feels like a movie where I'm sure I saw parodies of this prior to watching Jaws. I can think of SpongeBob in particular. There's the episode where they had to try and face off against the giant clam. And Sandy does like the whole Quint thing.
Right.
It's a beat for beat parody of Jaws down to, I think, isn't that the one where Mr. Krabs also does like the orchestra thing? And it sounds very suspiciously similar to Jaws and shit like that.
I think.
Or there's another episode. There's plenty of SpongeBob episodes where they reference Jaws.
Yes, the one I'm thinking of is like there's a giant like worm, and like Sandy does the like nails on a chalkboard, and she's like, "I'll catch that worm for you." I don't know. I had seen so many of the like parodies that by the time I saw it, it was kind of, I watched the movie and I was like, oh, that's the classic like scene, or that's the classic line.
We should mention this. We're recording this on Zoom, and Brian has a picture of one of the many Simpsons parodies of Jaws.
Yes,
in which the sea captain is clutched in Jaws' mouth. This is definitely one of those movies, kind of like the Simpsons writers joked often about, like, you could piece together the entirety of Citizen Kane through parodies on the Simpsons.
Yes.
You can do pretty much the same with like parodies of Jaws from various different productions and whatnot. And I think that was the big thing, is like this movie also felt like an early example of me getting into like a film nerd obsessive movie that is referenced constantly even after this, where I would see, say, Kevin Smith does a lot of homages to Jaws in his various films, which I know you're not at all familiar with, because that's definitely that shows a bit of our gap.
It does a little bit. I have seen nothing of Kevin Smith,
which is fascinating to me, and I think that might be rectified at some point in this. I don't know if rectified's the right word. I have a very complicated relationship with that man's films, but this was definitely one of those where like so much of it is seeped into the pop culture lexicon that it becomes kind of a language unto itself. Yeah. Even just small, simple things like I just recently saw No Hard Feelings. Oh, the Jennifer Lawrence movie. Right. Very funny movie. Kind of getting mediocre reviews. I think that movie deserves a bit better. But there's a point where they make a Jaws joke, and then the actor like has to strip down, the main like male lead, and he strips down and his underwear is covered in anchors. Okay. And then instantly just gives a Jaws connection with like Murray Hamilton's character. Yes. Of his amazing suit covered in anchors.
It's a great jacket. I want that jacket.
Yes, for sure. But yeah, so let's get a bit more into the film itself,
Yeah.
which, as I mentioned, came out in the summer of 1975 from director Steven Spielberg. He made a lot of television before this, like he had directed the pilot for Columbo.
Yes.
And he had done, some TV movies, an episode of Night Gallery with Joan Crawford, some of that stuff, and then The Sugarland Express, which had come out the previous year and was kind of like received in a lukewarm kind of way and wasn't like a huge smash. But it is fascinating realizing that he made this movie at like 27.
I was trying to do the math last night where I was like, how old was he when he made this movie? And I mean, yeah, like it's interesting that he like had come from that TV background and had like kind of already like made a lot of things, and so had that experience to come in and make Jaws. And you just like have you seen the Sugarland Express, right?
I have seen The Sugarland Express, yes.
I really like that movie a lot. That's a great movie.
I think, yeah, it's underrated in terms of like the sort of Spielberg lexicon. It's very different from a lot of his other movies too. That's the one that feels the most sort of like 70s auteur driven,
Yeah.
as it were, from like that particular era. And it definitely feels like he's more recalling some of his stuff that like Robert Altman would do and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it feels a lot more kind of grounded, character focused. But I think you can see even the seeds from there of like what would happen in a Jaws. And of course, some of his TV work in particular, I think we'll be talking about one of those in a segment.
Yes, we
so
will.
Put a pin in that.
Yes.
About one of the sort of direct correlation. One of the main reasons why Spielberg even wanted to do this was it was very similar to a TV film he had done previously. But it is still amazing that he did this at such a young age, and it's especially fascinating if you watch any behind-the-scenes stuff filmed at Martha's Vineyard, where if you know anything about the production of this movie, it was chaotic and definitely not something, say, a 27-year-old man could probably handle. With especially all these, like, experienced actors and veteran crew members and just, like, you can feel the weight of it on him. There's a great featurette on the Blu-ray that's just, like, on the set of Jaws. And it's him being interviewed, and he just looks like he has so much panic in his eyes. He's just, like, barely keeping it together. We're just like, oh, yeah, we're shooting this and this. And you can tell inside he's just like, I'm fucking freaking out. They showed, like, a bit in that behind the scenes where he's filming, like, the original version of the Ben Gardner, like, finding his capsized boat.
Oh,
the
right,
version that wasn't in the movie.
When they go in at night?
Well, that's the thing, is that in this footage that was shown, it was shot during the day. The original version. Huh. That I guess he ended up reshooting over. It's interesting seeing that bit. But he says, like, this is our second day at sea. I have 54 more days left.
Jesus.
It's like, oh, Stevie. Especially, it's weird realizing this is the first studio production actually shot on the ocean, which is interesting.
That is
like,
interesting.
whenever you see older movies that are shot on water, it tends to be like a giant tank in a studio.
Yeah, thinking of like early Bond movies, the way that like they would quote unquote shoot underwater, like what's the one like Thunderball or something, but.
Yeah, Thunderball's the big one where they shoot underwater.
Yeah.
Or even earlier than that, you have, like, the Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Right, I've never...
Like that was shot, like, actual...
I've actually never seen that movie.
It's an interesting movie. It definitely... Also, it feels definitely like a movie that I could tell Spielberg probably saw at a young age and inspired a lot of stuff from this movie.
Sure, yeah.
Especially sort of like the seafaring elements of it. Kirk Douglas even feels like the more Disneyfied version of a Quint in that movie.
Okay.
Though this movie does not have a fun sea lion... sidekick for them to play around with, which is a shame. I think that's a real loss for this movie. There's no sea lion that goes herb and everything. Real disappointment. It's definitely like a young Spielberg coming into this, and we won't go through the whole history of the movie because it's been well documented in various other places, but roughly Spielberg was given this by the producers David Brown and Richard D. Zanuck, who needed somebody to direct this movie based on the Peter Benchley novel, which was very successful. I have not read the Peter Benchley novel, so I can't really judge it.
Yeah, I haven't either.
Okay. Yeah, because all the stuff that I know is stuff that they apparently cut out of this movie, which I'm kind of glad they did. Like, apparently, there's a whole subplot in the book that involves Hooper and Mrs. Brody having an affair.
Oh.
But I'm like, I don't get how that would even, like, work. Really,
Yeah.
in the context of, like, this. It's, like, not even just, like, oh, it betrays the characters. Like, this movie's just too... like compact in terms of how many days it takes place over.
Yeah.
For them to have like an affair, because I think Hooper's on the island like 48 hours before they even go out to have their adventure.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the one scene where he goes and like has dinner with them, which is a great scene. I love that scene so much. But yeah, it's a weird plot line.
Yeah. That's one of many things that they changed here. But yeah, apparently Spielberg did want to do this. Was offered this role was offered to direct this movie, and he was very curious about it. He went through various different sort of production things with who he was going to cast, and ultimately we got Roy Scheider as Brody, our main lead, and we got Richard Dreyfuss as Hooper, and then we've got, of course, Robert Shaw as Quint. And what's so fascinating is hearing, like, this was one of the early examples of, like, finding out about the production of this movie. A very early sort of urtext for me getting into, like, the background of film is watching the making of Jaws, not on a DVD, but on the second VHS, because my dad had, like, the 2 VHS collection.
Oh, interesting.
On the second tape, there was a 2-hour documentary that's on the Blu-ray now and stuff like that from, like, the 90s of the making of Jaws, and it's like everybody being interviewed, and the whole history is fascinating. But basically, TLDR, everybody went to Martha's Vineyard with these various different giant sharks that were tested originally in freshwater, these animatronic sharks that were totally going to work, except when they got into seawater, everyone realized, oh no, wait, we didn't test this correctly, and the sharks aren't working. So all the plans they had for these sharks had to be very limited, as anytime the shark would like pop up, it would screw up, and then there would be massive delays, which this movie ended up having massive delays over, I think, like, it was supposed to be like a month or 2 long shoot, ended up being like a 4 or 5 month shoot.
Jesus.
Basically, just like it's a giant, massive disaster, and there were conflicts on set, particularly with Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw. I know, Richard Dreyfuss being difficult with people. Never heard it before.
The least surprising thing I've heard about this movie is that Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw did not get along.
But then there's also just like all the other weird stuff that I didn't even know, that wasn't even in that documentary. Like, apparently Robert Shaw had tax problems and would often go from like Martha's Vineyard up to Canada to avoid tax people. And shit like that. So that's just another thing where like one of your leads has to go up there. And also he was a massive drunk. So he was definitely like drunk all the time on set and stuff like that. So just a lot of problems happening throughout the entire production. And they had to severely edit it and go through a lot of post-production stuff. And then it became the greatest fucking movie that grossed so much money ever made.
Yeah. It's so funny to think that, like, going through the kind of behind the scenes stuff and hearing about all the problems, because like, I don't know, if you didn't know, none of that would come off on screen, because everything about the movie is so, I mean, you called it compact. It's such a like brisk movie almost, even though it's 2 hours long. No part of it feels no part of it screams like disaster was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, we have that all the time now, where like troubled production rumors swill around a movie, and that kind of like dampens the movie to a certain extent. That was even the case with Jaws. Like, there would have been, production difficulty, like articles and stuff that had come out in like Hollywood Reporter and Variety, places like that. But, it just shows that like even massive production problems don't always mean a movie will be bad as a result.
Yeah.
That's often the case.
Yeah.
But there are exceptions, and Jaws is one of those big, huge exceptions.
Yeah.
My big question to start this off in terms of the movie for you is, who do you identify with most of our main trio? Who, like, immediately is just like, that's the guy I identify with the most of these three?
It's fun. They're all three of these boys are so great. I love Roy Scheider. I feel like he's one of those 70s actors that doesn't get as much credit as he should. I like just watched All That Jazz for the first time like a couple days ago, and he is so great in that movie. But I do kind of like Richard Dreyfuss's his attempts when they're like talking to the mayor, and the mayor's just like, nope, 4th of July weekend, we're gonna keep it going, and Richard Dreyfuss just starts like laughing because he knows just how like stupid this guy is being. So I think I definitely related to that. But I also just love Quint because he's like kind of insane and kind of weird. Yeah, but I don't know. Dreyfuss is really good in this movie as well. I really like him.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say I probably do relate more to Brody, if anything else, because Brody is such a fascinating like lead for a big blockbuster movie, where especially nowadays, if you have a lead in a blockbuster movie, he has to be the toughest guy possible, and he has to, like, if he has any vulnerability, it's very like overt and has to be part of the plot, basically, that he has, like, a dead wife or something like that, as opposed to, like, Brody is this guy who just feels very much like a dad.
He is, yeah. He's just like a good dad.
Right, he's a good dad, and also, like, it's Roy Scheider, who is one of the most leathery men to ever, like,
really
be
is.
in movies.
Yeah.
Like, just the way that his, like, face creases and stuff, like, smiles or frowns or anything like that, just, like, it tells a whole story.
Yeah.
And I just feel like all that insecurity that he has, like, one of my favorite bits is during the scar scene, which is so great, where you have Hooper and Quint trading off, like, oh, there's, I got this scar and this scar, and you know Brody has a scar.
Yeah, he, like,
because
lifts
they
up his
established he had been
shirt.
shot. Right, yeah, and they established he'd been shot back when he was in New York City as a cop, and then moved out to Amity, which takes place presumably in like the shores of like eastern New York State, basically.
Yeah, they mentioned like Nantucket and stuff, so.
Yeah. What I love is just that, like, he knows that, and he kind of like looks around. He's just like, do I show them my scar? And he's like, no.
Yeah.
This is my thing. Like, this is a dude who's like gone through so much, and he has clear like a emotional attachment to these things, but at the same time, he's like, I can keep certain things close to the vest. I'm not going to be in the middle of this dick measuring contest.
He plays a really great like sheriff or like whatever he is. He has just this like stoicism, and you trust Brody as a character to like do the right thing because of Roy Scheider. He's great. He's a really great actor.
Yeah, and I think you feel especially a lot of sort of the great early examples of Spielberg being able to like pick out certain details for his characters. Like early on, I love like how Amity feels like a real location in this movie, and it's all because of how everyone interacts with Roy Scheider. Where you've got the whole like, oh, these kids are karateing up the fences, and so like that's their biggest concern. Even like the mayor later on is just like, hey, these kids are destroying my fences. I don't know what's going on. Like they're also like want to have these like smaller scapegoat problems that are going on. That feel like, oh, this is what matters here in Amity, not like a big shark attack. That doesn't happen here.
Yeah.
We're all chill in this beach town. That's not what matters. And I think that all comes through like Roy Scheider, who knows what like massive upsetting things are from working in New York City and then coming to this place. He wanted to like basically retire and be like, I want to have a less stressful fucking thing happening for me. And now there's a shark.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he treats that threat seriously. So he's such a great everyman kind of character where it's like, look, I wanted to relax, but I'm not relaxing while there's this giant threat out there that's killing everybody.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the movie is the first scene that he has with, the first like conversation he has with the mayor, which is on like the raft. I mean, one of the many things I love about this movie is like the way it's shot and the way Spielberg, I mean, he does like these really long takes, but in like that scene is it's just all on the raft, and you can see all of like his like cronies in the background and stuff, and basically him telling him like, we're not going to freak out. This is fine. Everything is fine. We're going to be open. And yeah, he really sells that scene. He's really great.
You yell Barracuda. Everyone says, what?
Yeah.
Who? You yell shark. We have a panic on our hands on the 4th of July.
Yeah.
It's Murray Hamilton doing an amazing job of instilling severe skepticism in me of elected officials very early on when I watched this. I still remember like the scene with the Kittner mom later on and her like completely destroying Brody.
Oh my
instantaneously God, put that kind of like anger in me about like, but that's not his fault. It's the mayor's fault.
Right.
From a very young age. So once again, elected officials on site do not trust.
Yeah, it is very funny watching this movie now and thinking, I wonder what modern events may, this relates to in terms of like shutting things down and stuff like that. And I do love the scene later when it's sort of after the like 4th of July attack, and when he goes in like the hospital with the mayor and he's kind of telling him like, I told you so. And the mayor he says this line that's like, it's kind of devastating, but like you still hate him, where he's like, my son was on the beach too. And it is just this line where I'm like, oh, I have some sympathy for you, but you're still such an asshole.
Right. That's the thing, is that Spielberg at his best tends to make even his villain characters very human.
Yeah.
In a weird way. And I think that's what's really fascinating. Like you can see it here, and it like progresses forward with many of his different villain characters, where you don't necessarily think like, oh, this guy's not so bad. But it's just like, no, this is a recognizable kind of evil the kind of banality of evil, where it's just like, look, I'm here to help out the town. I need to make sure we get our sum of dollars. This is where we get all our money and all this other stuff. And even like the scene where it's Brody, the mayor, and Hooper arguing in front of the giant freaking billboard.
Oh my god, yeah, that
with just like, where his main concern is just like, I need to know who's graffitiing
right
on my billboard over here.
Yeah, and I mean, like, even the scene that's like you were talking about, like Amity feeling like a real like place. There's the scene where like after the like very first shark attack, I believe, where like they're almost like doing like a town meeting sort of thing, and Brody kind of he's the one who says that they're shutting down, and everyone is like upset, and it's kind of a thing where I was almost like, I'm like, oh yeah, they're upset that they're shutting down because this is like it's their community, and yeah, it adds a sense of place to Amity, which is great.
Right, and even like the very recognizable sort of figures that show up, like in that scene, you also have one of my favorites, the one lady who's super over tanned, who is constantly just like in these meeting halls, and like, she actually appears in the Jaws sequels as like one of the main trustees of Amity. You're just like, oh, this is a lady who spent her entire life on the beach.
Is she the one who like elected officials is like, is that 3,000 going to be in cash or check? And is she the one who's like, I didn't think that was funny?
Yes, I didn't think that was funny. Yes, her. She's so great. But even that scene has one of my favorite ADR lines I hear no one talk about, but it's always stuck with me. It's like a really funny line where Brody says like, oh, we're going to close down the beaches, and the mayor's like, only for 24 hours. And then there's this one like random female voice who's just like, 24 hours? That's like 3 weeks. Yeah. It's like, okay. I guess the math works out for that shit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do like how like the fact that they cast a lot of regulars from Martha's Vineyard in this movie just like really shows up. Like the Kittner mom, Lee Fierro is her name. She was just like the lady who ran the local theater over there in Martha's Vineyard. Or even one of my favorites, the guy who plays Ben Gardner, who I believe his name was hold on, I have it here. His name is, this is great radio.
Yeah, I'm looking as well. Craig Kingsbury.
Yes, Craig Kingsbury, who plays Ben Gardner, and it's just this guy who's like such a salty fisherman. He like, and apparently was a lot of the basis for certain things that Quint says, like even the bluegills and tommycots. That's literally a line that he apparently said during like the initial interview where Spielberg was interviewing him for like, oh yeah, you should be in the movie. And like that kind of like salty sea energy is so crucial to making Amity feel like a real place.
All the fishermen are so like funny, yes. Just in the background, because they're all like they have these like thick Boston accents, and they're so funny. Like it's when Hooper like first arrives, and he's like, Brody's like, you're there's too many people in that boat. Like those guys are hilarious.
What's also so fascinating about like even like a Quint is that despite the fact it's Robert Shaw, who later I would find out, of course, was like in From Russia with Love and Man for All Seasons, a celebrated British character actor. When I saw this movie initially, I thought like, oh, this is some guy who was a local salty sea dog.
Yeah, he looks like that. Who is just
in this movie.
Yeah.
He looks like that. He feels like that. Even there's the scenes where he's got like this little toady guy next to him. He's not in the movie that much, but like when he gets like the chalkboard scene, he's like right next to him. There's a deleted scene where he's like, I'm not going on that boat, Quint. Like, I see the two of them together. I'm like, these dudes have been fishing for years. Yeah. There's no way that's just a local Martha's Vineyard guy and this is an Academy Award nominated British character actor. No way. But yeah, he even like infused that, despite the fact that he's very much a caricature. You still just feel like, nope, this dude is a real life salty sea dog.
Yeah, and he's really good. I mean, like the scene where he's like explaining about the boat that went down during like World War II. He's like, it's a great scene, and
the Indianapolis.
Yes, and you're like hooked on like every word because he's just like, he sounds amazing, and you're just tuned into whatever this guy's saying.
One of my favorite deliveries in here is at the very tail end of that speech where he's like, "Well, we delivered the bomb." Just the perfect punctuation point for that upsetting, horrifying speech. It's like, but no, we did our job all right. So everyone could get murdered over there in Hiroshima.
Yeah.
We did it. So it was all worth it, right? We did it so like even more people could get killed than that were killed senselessly by these sharks. There was something a couple years ago, even after all the infamous sequels, which we'll talk about in a bit, but where Spielberg was like, oh, I always kind of wanted to see a movie about Quint on the Indianapolis. Just like an actual Indianapolis movie.
That'd be interesting.
I'll say this, of any kind of like, oh, let's do another movie related to Jaws, that's the best idea, I guess.
Yeah.
Because sequelizing this movie doesn't make much sense, but I guess prequelizing it makes a certain amount of sense.
I haven't seen any of the sequels. I thought about it, and then I realized that they're probably terrible. I mean, am I right?
I mean, I guess we can get into this now briefly, sure. I have seen all the Jaws movies.
How many are there?
And I will say there are 4.
Jesus.
There are 4 overall, 3 sequels, basically. Where you've got Jaws 2, which mostly takes place at Martha's Vineyard and does have a couple people reprise their roles like Lorraine Gray and Roy Scheider and Murray Hamilton. That movie feels very much kind of like, oh, we're retreading a lot of the same ground from the original Jaws, but also the kids are teenagers now. So like, oh, there goes like the main kid who's off with like all his teenage friends, and they get caught in a Jaws situation out there, whatever. Jaws 3D is very bad as well, but it has the novelty of being like weird early 80s 3D, which is very funny. And has Dennis Quaid as like the adult versions of one of the Brody kids.
Okay.
Which is also weird. Jaws the Revenge is fascinating to me. I have the weird hot take where everyone thinks that's the worst one of the worst movies ever made. I think it's very bad, but I would say at least the most interesting out of these Jaws sequels. In that, do you know the premise at all of Jaws the Revenge? I'm very curious if you know anything.
The only thing I know about this movie is it's the one with Michael Caine, and it's where they like asked him about it years later, and he was like, "I wanted a yacht."
Well, the quote that he said was that I have not seen Jaws 4, which I've heard is very terrible. However, I have seen The House That Is Blood, and it is magnificent, which is great.
Yeah,
amazing quote.
What is the plot of Jaws the Revenge?
The plot of Jaws the Revenge, it centers around Lorraine Gray, Brody's wife, who in this movie it's revealed that like Brody died in like from a heart attack, but she claims no, it's the shark that killed him. The fear is what killed him. And then early on, one of the Brody kids dies. She's so grief-stricken and upset that the other one, who lives in the Bahamas now, is like, "Hey, Mom, why don't you come with us to the Bahamas and you can have a vacation and a romance with Michael Caine." And also, so it's like, okay, sure. And the shark that just killed her son travels to the Bahamas and gets there before she does and starts stalking them. And yeah, so the shark is very much like the tagline of that is like, "This time it's personal." So they literally take that to its largest extent of like, yes, it is personal. This shark is out to specifically kill you.
That's so funny.
It's funny. It's very much a bad movie. I would never say it's a good movie, but I would say all of that stuff makes it interesting, including like I think the biggest thing that makes at least my preferred of the sequels is that there's actually a pretty decent like middle-aged person romance between her and Michael Caine.
Okay.
That I didn't really expect. I'm like, oh, this is different. This is interesting.
Sure.
At least, okay. But yeah, it's still bad. And they stopped. That was 87, and that was so bad they have not made any other like Jaws follow-ups officially. Universal hasn't, except for The Ride. Did you ever ride The Ride? I'm curious. We haven't talked this much. Were you much of a theme park person?
Not really. I've been to Universal like once or twice. I remember like I went right as they opened the like Harry Potter world, so I went to like that when I was like a teenager.
So you stepped on the corpse of Amity, because that's where the whole Amity section was in the Jaws ride.
Oh, really? Oh, that's...
Yes. That's why if you go by like right before you hit Harry Potter, there's the shark that's hanging down there. That's like a tiger shark.
Yeah.
From this movie.
Yeah.
That's like the sort of marker, the memorial for the former Amity that used to be there.
Oh.
And the ride was basically just like you go on a tour of like the little Amity Island, which was weird because you go through like a little kind of like miniature recreation. Like, it literally looks like very small, like all the buildings and stuff. So you're like, I guess is Brody like very small, and he lives here? It's just like, is he a gnome size? Is that what this is?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. This is very odd. And then the shark attacks you while you're on the boat.
I
and it's
see.
like, oh no,
I'm
the shark's attacking us.
I'm looking up pictures of the ride on Google.
It was a ride that I rode many times as a child and was very initially terrified by, and then comically amused by as I got older and rode that ride. And theme park people have a weird obsession with just like, oh no, you can't tear this down. I loved it so much. Why? It's like, I rode that ride probably like a year or two before they destroyed it for Harry Potter. I'm like, I get it, guys. Like, this ride's in rough shape. And I don't know if they have as much interest in preserving it. You can still go to Universal Studios Japan and ride if you want.
Oh, really?
You know, book your Japan trip.
Interesting.
And ride Amity in Japan. But anyway, we're getting far off track of the movie itself.
Yes.
But we talked about Brody quite a bit. And we were kind of talking about Quint. Let's talk about Hooper a bit more.
Yes.
I think Hooper is very interesting. Where like that sort of 3-person dynamic of that trio, I think is curious because it kind of feels like, you know, the 3 sort of pieces of man, in terms of like, you know, like there's the ego, who is like the guy who's in the middle ground between superego and id, who I would argue is Brody.
Right.
Then Quint, I would argue, is the id, which is the more like impulsive, almost like naturalistic, animalistic. And then the superego, who is like more trying to like work through logic, which I would argue is Hooper. And I think that trio is a perfect encapsulation of like those 3 kind of stages, as it were, of like a man's mind. Of just like, oh, I want to be out there adventuring versus I want to study things logically, or the middle, just like, guys, I don't know if we can do this that well.
Yeah.
We gotta keep ourselves in check about this.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, like, yeah, at the end when they're all 3 on the boat, just especially when they're sort of in the heat of it, like in one of the shark attacks, you get a sense of like these 3, like their dynamics kind of working together, but also like clashing. And yeah, I mean, speaking about Richard Dreyfuss as Hooper, a thing I love about this movie is that he's the like expert brought in from like the outside because he knows about sharks. And a thing I love that this movie doesn't do, which so many movies since do, is that the like expert and the like sheriff kind of bash heads because, you know, he doesn't want someone from the outside telling him what to do. Brody's very like open to Hooper. He's like welcoming. They don't feud ever, which I love in this movie.
Yeah, Brody is the one who invited him onto the island.
Yes, right.
For some kind of like help at that point, as opposed to like the mayor and everybody else who just does not want that around. And I think Hooper works so brilliantly as especially kind of like he's clearly like the younger of the 3, and he has that kind of like youthful, rebellious energy to him, is like sort of a constant throughout this. But at the same time, he also has like more of an idea of like in theory what a shark can do and what like the parameters are. So when you have stuff like the tiger shark scene, where anyone else would think like, oh yeah, we caught a giant shark and it's all good and we're all over with this, and he points out the tiger shark, leading to, of course, one of my favorite lines in the movie of the one guy reacting with, "Oh what?" Which is amazing.
It's so funny.
So good. One of my favorite, like, one-line guy. I love the fact that, too, that guy has such a weird, high-pitched, "oh, what?" Even though when you hear him, he has, like, such a gravelly voice. Just like, what are you talking about? A tiger shark? That makes no sense.
A what?
A what? Him, like, questioning and, like, giving us all, like, the parameters. Like, look, here's what we know about sharks. And here's, like, all the things that we can rule about, like, what this massive, almost megalodon version of a shark is with the great white. So, like, it makes any of the stuff that feels like, oh, this is, like, outside of the realm of, like, what we know about sharks. It makes it all feel more real because, like, we have an expert who's like, we can rule out all this other shit that's actually real. And this is, like, the weird shit that we have to contend with, like, a Quint in order to somewhat resolve. And I think that's what's so key is, like, they never make him be, like, the, oh, you have no idea what you're expecting kind of guy, as opposed to, like, look, I know what to expect. This ain't normal.
Yeah, I do love, I mean, like, later on as well, when sort of right before all 3 of them like go out on the boat, when like Quint is kind of like, here, tie this like knot, and you get the sense that like Hooper he knows his stuff. He's not like an idiot. The scene with Hooper and Brody and his wife when he like invites them over, and he brings like the 2 bottles of wine, which is I really love that scene as well because it's giving more character to Hooper, but also to both Brody and his wife, and Richard Dreyfuss is really good in that scene as well. The way him and what is her name,
Lorraine Gray.
The way that they are kind of like going off of each other, and Brody just kind of like sits there and is like pouring the wine. It's a great scene.
And by the way, I apologize. I just did this, and I did this several times before. It's actually Lorraine Gary.
Lorraine Gary.
My fault. My bad. Lorraine Gary, yes.
Okay.
Who, interestingly, didn't do a lot of acting beyond, like, she'd been in some TV stuff before this and was in the Jaws 2 and 4 and, like, a couple other things after this. But she is actually the wife of Sid Sheinberg, who was the guy who was running Universal at the time. You might like in some world, some people might figure like, oh, that's a nepotism thing. She's not that great an actress. It's not true because she's like genuinely very like down to earth in a way that fits with Roy Scheider.
Yeah,
and you feel the believability. Like I love the scenes early on where it's like, oh, you gotta kind of get used to this place, and he does the whole like pack the cat over by the yard, and she's like, you fit right in.
Yeah,
it's just perfect. Like you get a sense that these people have been married for a while. And even like the great scene where like the kids are out in a little pontoon boat thing, and she's looking through like the book and it's like, look, they just want to play out there. It's fine. I'm not sure they would want to go in the ocean after what happened today, but they're just sitting there on the boat. Looks at the book and just, Michael, did you hear your father? Get out of there. She feels very much like also a naturalistic mom.
Yeah,
that really bounces off Scheider quite well.
I love that scene because one, it's hilarious, but I love it because it feels like a genuine human moment between these people just in this situation. Getting into more of like the family stuff, I love the scene with Brody and his son at the dinner table where he's like copying what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite Brody lines is the bit where he's just like, give me a kiss. Why? Because I need it.
Yeah.
That feels like the most
get out of here.
Believable, frustrated dad thing possible.
Yeah.
We've talked many times, the two of us as friends, about like our love of Spielberg. And particularly, you really like sort of like the later Spielberg era.
Yeah.
Can you see a lot of like the early hallmarks here that would end up coming back with like the sort of that late 90s to early 2000s era you really dig so much? Can you see the early seeds of that in Jaws?
Yeah. I mean, like, most people, I feel like, might say that Spielberg, his kind of like, that 80s run, that kind of late 70s and 80s run is his like peak.
Right, because we all love 1941.
We do. We love 1941. We love Always. We love... But,
Empire of the Sun, everyone's favorite, baby.
But I really love that 2000s run that he does. And yeah, you do get a sense for kind of what he values in terms of like the story of the movie. There's a cynicism towards, like you mentioned, like elected officials in it. There's a scene on like the 4th of July where there's the big kind of like everyone runs out of the beach when they think that there's a shark in the water, and which it ends up just being like the kids. But during that scene, there's this like the mob mentality of it all is like really taking over. You see like a guy like push a couple kids off a raft and like use the raft, and like he will cut to a shot of like an old person like just lying there, and these moments of like, this is what people will do when they're panicked. There's a lot of that, which obviously fits into a lot of his 2000s stuff like Minority Report and War of the Worlds and stuff like that. So that aspect really jumped out to me, like watching this now and thinking of like later Spielberg.
Well, especially when I think Spielberg kind of gets that Amblin label on him.
Yeah.
From a lot of people where it's like, oh, Spielberg is just like with whimsical, fantastical movies. And he's done plenty of those.
Yes.
But I don't think people like ever give Spielberg enough credit for the amount of like true, not necessarily cynicism, but like the amount of stuff he puts in where like, oh, I only have this like big whimsical stuff because I know like the nature of like what people can be, especially like in that mob mentality thing you're talking about. Like in groups, people can be a terrifying thing.
Yes.
And I think like this movie does a great job early on of kind of expressing that, or even with like a group where you have like 3 different men in like a Brody, a Quint, and a Hooper who individually all could be like, oh, these are like fun people I would want to like potentially be around for a bit, but you put them all in isolation on a boat and things get fucking crazy. Like they can't like survive well enough when they're all on their own. And even with like the mob mentality here, like it really lends credence to, the modern sort of thing, like, oh, why do we have to make art political? Why do we have to look for political things in art? Like, a movie's just a movie. There's no political angle. Even in, like, a rousing, fun movie like Jaws, there's an inherently political context of, like, this fear of, like, authority figures, not trusting experts in the situation as everything comes crumbling around. Like, you were referencing earlier in a joking matter, like, in a post-COVID age, Jaws feels less and less like fun, whimsical blockbuster.
It does.
And more of like a sobering treatment of like, oh, this is what happened. Even down to, I mentioned her earlier, the Lee Fierro, the Kittner mom, she died of COVID.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just an interesting little tie that kind of like, I think even more cements that kind of like, a thing that was true in 1975 and is true to now, which is just like, many like people at the top are not looking out for your best interest as much as the best interest of a quote-unquote greater good that isn't really like helping individuals out at all and leaving them out to sea.
Yeah, and I think like
get it? Hey, get it? I don't know if you got. I'm waiting for my applause. How great that was.
That was great.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Continue with your whatever point you were making.
Yeah, like you said, people kind of put that sort of like whimsical thing on Spielberg, but I think it is because he is like ultimately like an optimist. I think he does like eventually see the good in people, but I think also a thing that people never really maybe give Spielberg enough credit for is how like gnarly some of his movies can be at times. Even this movie, like I'm thinking of the first shark attack when you where the shark kills the little boy, and you see like just a figure above the water and then like just like some blood gushing out, and it is this surprisingly like violent scene in this movie.
Right. And I think it's also interesting just given, this movie, I think we can both agree it is a horror film. Some people try and debate that.
No, it absolutely
is.
No,
it's an adventure. Like it can be a lot of things. I think one of them mainly is horror. And it's fascinating considering Spielberg didn't really direct another horror movie after this. I think, like, the closest one could argue was, like, a Poltergeist, which he wrote and produced. Some say he directed.
Right.
Though I would still make the argument that that's very much a Tobe Hooper film at the same time. It's got Spielberg's touches on it.
It does, yeah.
But, yeah, you can see how, like, a lot of his later films still have that kind of, like, horrific edge where, like you mentioned, he sees the best in individuals. I think that's the case. But he also sees the terror in, like, a group.
Yeah.
With, like, I could see so much of, especially, like, this is the first time I've seen this movie in a while since I revisited AI, and I gained my huge appreciation for AI, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And you can see so many of the horror sequences in that feel about as like visceral and upsetting as like any of the sequences in Jaws. It's just those involve like robots with oil instead of like gore that's coming all over the place.
Yeah. Or like one of my favorite Spielberg films like of all time is War of the Worlds, and I think that is like maybe the closest he's come to since Jaws to making a horror movie because of like the nature of that. But that movie has a lot of the same things as Jaws of like the like you mentioned, the sort of people as a whole are not always gonna be calm under pressure. Looking at kind of Spielberg's career, like do you hold Jaws as like on high regard as his other films? I'm curious.
I would say it is my favorite of Spielberg's movies. My top 3 Spielbergs are Jaws, Raiders, and then Catch Me If You Can. Oh. I think those are like 3 like masterpieces from him, like my tip-top favorite 3, even though there are plenty of like great near-perfect movies like around it.
Right.
I just think those 3 movies do a great job of displaying like everything I love about Spielberg in terms of like the blockbuster, like fun, whimsical nature, and then the terrifying elements of it, and even a lot more of like the darker themes that are handled, especially about like family. Like even in this movie, you do have that where you have like this family man Brody who is like crumbling, but trying to keep it together because like of his kids and of his his wife, and even being a sort of weird father figure to Amity and trying to keep that together. Like even I love the relationship he has with his deputy. Jeffrey Kramer in this movie, where there's like a bit of like a bumbling deputy nature to that guy, but at the same time he like wants like the best for that dude, and he's still just constantly just like, I don't know, man, you gotta like do something. Like later on when Hooper first shows up, and you can see him like waving at Brody.
That's the funniest thing I've ever seen.
Just like And stuff that where he has like interest in like preserving everybody, but he is like crumbling apart as like a guy who's like, I have to save everybody and I can't, and I'm fucking freaking out and stuff like that. You can see like that stuff even ripples through as well, like those concerns about like a dad who wants to make it seem like everything's okay, but it's not, all the way down to like the Fablemans. Brody and Paul Dano have more in common than you would expect.
Yeah, I will say my top three Spielberg. My number one, I think, will always be Close Encounters of the Third Kind. My top 2 and 3 are always like switching. Right now, I have E.T. and Jurassic Park.
But yeah, that's the thing, is that dude has so many masterpieces that it's hard to kind of like narrow one down necessarily.
It is, yeah.
Or even narrow 3 down. But so I guess the other sort of the fourth lead of this movie we haven't really talked about that much is Bruce the Shark.
Yeah.
Of course, as he was nicknamed on the set because he was named after Steven Spielberg's lawyer, allegedly. Fun lawyer joke. We all love him, but it's so fun. But he, as I mentioned, that shark would like constantly break down, sank to the bottom of Martha's Vineyard at one point while they were trying to shoot a shot, like all this chaos. And the famous thing about this movie is that we were originally going to see more of the shark, but it ended up being the case where, through necessity, we have to not feature the shark that much and cut around it, thanks to Verna Fields, who won an Oscar for her editing in this movie, one of the few surprising Oscars this was nominated for. There's a lot of stuff about this shark that, like, the few naysayers of Jaws, if they're going to nitpick anything, it's usually like, the shark looks fake. A common thing. Even Robert Zemeckis made that joke in Back to the Future Part 2, with the shark that still looks fake.
Right, yeah.
Jaws 19. So, I'm curious, how do you feel about the shark, the few glimpses we get of Bruce? Do you feel that it looks that fake, or do you feel it still works for the movie?
I find it really funny that people say that the shark looks bad in this movie, because it's like, it is one of those things of like, don't show it, and he really, like, obviously because of the production, like, doesn't show the shark so many times, and I think that because you don't see it that often, when you do see it, it creates this like almost awe or wonder where you're like, oh my gosh, there's the shark. And I don't know, I think it still looks great. I mean, the fact that it is this like analog visual effect, that it's like a real like big thing, I still think it looks really great. And I love that all of the like early on, before we ever see the shark, that most of the shots are like POVs of the shark, like from the shark's perspective.
Yeah, I think if we saw more of the shark, I could get having that complaint, because if you watch any of the behind the scenes material, like during the great like chum some of this shit and then the shark pops up thing, if they sit on for like another fraction of a second, you would see that shark like flinging and like falling apart, and you can hear the hydraulics like bursting basically inside of there. So I guess if you saw more of it, but even the stuff we do get, I always interpreted like, the shark looks fake, is like, this is a shark that is otherworldly almost. It is a great white. They establish as like it's 25 feet long, like a great white shark would be, and all this other stuff. But this shark is almost just like this otherworldly being that resembles a shark, but it could just as easily be a demon in shark's clothing to some extent. And I think any of that fakeness just makes it feel more like this is just something from the depths of the ocean. Given, like, we have that thing all the time now where it's like, we've explored only, like, 25% of the real ocean, and there's so much down in the depths that James Cameron's the only one who's ever seen any of it. And this is one of these, like, creatures that came from the depths of the ocean or hell or whatever, and is up here just destroying people. I think that's what makes it work, is, like, it feels like it's close to a shark, but there's that uncanny valley that makes it more unsettling, like when it eats Quint. It's like, that in theory looks like a shark, but this is like a demonic entity.
Yeah.
That kind of resembles a shark more than anything else.
Yeah, I will say, like, there's a shot that I really love, and is like just a shot that I think, looks incredible, of like it's like the shark is just underneath the water, and I think it's when they're on the boat and you kind of see like Quint kind of in the foreground and the shark is in the water. And it's this incredibly menacing shot of just the shark right underneath the water, like just about to like leap out. Yeah, that's I think where I was like, this is still like a really impressive visual effect to this day.
Or even like how, given that sort of like we can't show the shark that much element, like it's what makes so much of the iconography work for this movie. It makes it so, this is an overused word, but iconic.
Yeah.
In its own way, of like the shark fin. just like, when the shark fin shows up and you hear the John Williams theme, which we haven't talked about that much. We'll talk about it a bit more in a second. But I feel like because like you just know the basic parameters of like you hear that music, you see a fin, you see any inkling of what a shark could be, and that spreads the terror. Even like to the degree that if you see this movie for the first time and you do see like the fake out that happens where the kids are there and there is no music, you still are kind of put in that fear and that terror. But then you realize like, oh wait, there was no music, so of course that's not the shark. That's not what's here.
Yeah.
And then the shark ends up like appearing off to the side, and then you hear that music and you know everything's up to shit. Like, it's a great example of like filmmaking to like really disguise like any of these imperfections and to also make this creature even more menacing than it would be if you just saw a robot shark who was just like right there in your face the whole time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, like, especially when you're talking about like when Brody is like, come chum some of this shit. And you see the shark. I mean, like, yeah, that is a perfect example of like Spielberg knowing exactly when to cut and when it will look too goofy if you like keep showing it a bit. But I think we should talk about the score by John Williams.
Oh, is this score like at all famous or acclaimed?
Oh, yeah.
To any degree? I'm not aware. I haven't been aware of any of this. I think this score apparently gets referenced a lot.
God, yeah, it is crazy how many times that's been referenced. But like, even like watching this movie again, I was like, because obviously everyone knows the main like Jaws theme, but the music in sort of the rest of the film is quite, and this is the magic of like, I think John Williams, is that he can give you that sort of dread that like theme has. Like when the movie starts and you hear it, you're just like, oh my God, this is terrifying. But the rest of the score is like when they're on the boat and there's like this wide shot of them just like riding in the boat. It's almost like whimsical in that kind of John Williams way, in like kind of like adventure kind of way that I really love.
It's truly a high-flying adventure. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's the big thing. Is I think it's weird how the main theme is so ingrained in pop culture, yet I feel like the rest of the score is massively underrated.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, where it's like the most celebrated theme of all time, but yet the big like adventure swelling stuff, like when they're putting the barrels on the shark, and you hear that like high-flying sort of like adventure themes. It feels like, oh, this is almost like a, an Errol Flynn like big adventure pirate movie, basically.
Yeah.
At the same time. But yeah, I think that's a real testament to like how great the score is in this movie. Even like during the quiet moments, it has a similar effect, where it is just like like the Brody like talking with his wife or any of these other things. The underscore works so beautifully to like illustrate all that stuff, that when the shark stuff happens, you're immediately just like on edge, unease. Even like we haven't talked about the opening of this fucking movie and how amazing it is.
It's an incredible
opening.
Two
Skinny dippers.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. That just instantly puts you in that unease and like introduces that theme that we're talking about. But then I like that there are so many points where that theme will like be so intense in playing, and like something horrible will be happening to somebody because of the shark, and how it just instantly drops out.
Yeah, I think it's I can't remember which death it is exactly, but there is like one of them is handled like the music just cuts out entirely and you just see the water like start to settle, and it's like really unsettling to watch.
We mentioned the editing and the score, and those two elements, along with the sound for the movie, garnered this 3 Oscars at the time that it came out. It was also nominated for Best Picture, but lost to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And Spielberg was very infamously resentful of not getting a Best Director nomination. I'm curious, have you seen the footage of him watching the Academy Award announcements?
No, in 1975?
Yes, oh my God, that's the thing. It's also, my Zoom picture is of one of his buddies, Joe Spinell, who was there and present. There was this whole thing where I think it was for Good Morning America or something, where like a crew came over and shot Steven Spielberg as he was watching like at early in the morning, watching the Academy Award announcements, where it's like, I'm going to get nominated for Best Director. It's going to sweep all the nominations. Jaws, biggest movie. It's going to work out. And you got fucking Joe Spinell, who you would know from like, he's a great character actor from like the 70s and 80s. He's in like the Godfather movies. Also Maniac, one of the great sleazy 80s horror movies. Just this dude who you see instantly, you're like, oh, Italian mobster man.
Yeah.
That's who that is.
Looks like an Italian mobster.
And like he's wearing a suit jacket and a Jaws t-shirt for this announcement. And there's another guy who's one of Spielberg's buddies with him, and they hear the announcement as it goes through, like, oh, here are the nominees, and it's like, I think for that one, it was Milos Forman for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and they mentioned Fellini was nominated for one of his movies at that time, and they go through all the nominees, and Spielberg's like, I didn't get it. I didn't get the nomination. After they later on, they show like, oh, he got nominated for Best Picture. Joe Spinell comes up like, all right, I got a lot of things to say here. Look, it makes no sense. Like, who directed this movie? Somebody's mother? Come on. It's so funny.
I will say, Jaws is a phenomenal movie, but the nominees this year are pretty stacked, I have to say.
Right, because I know One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, obviously.
So you have Fellini for Amarcord. I believe that's how you say that.
Okay.
You have Barry Lyndon, Stanley Kubrick.
Right.
You have Sidney Lumet for Dog Day Afternoon. And you have Robert Altman for Nashville, which is probably one of his best movies. So
I mean, look, I haven't seen the Fellini movie.
I also
but
haven't
those
seen the
other
Fellini movie.
ones are pretty fucking stacked.
They are,
Even
yeah.
though everything I've heard is like that was like a sort of, oh, he's getting older, this might be his last time he gets nominated kind of movies.
Yeah.
Kind of deals. And yeah, especially the fact that Spielberg is so pissed off about like Fellini over me. It's like that kind of young 28-year-old hubris kind of flushing out a bit.
A very quick thing I thought of during this movie is like because I keep thinking of the scene in Fabelmans when he goes to see John Ford, and the horizon, just that scene, and I kept looking at the horizons in this movie, and they're all like towards the top or towards the bottom, and I couldn't stop thinking about that. I thought it was funny.
That's true. It's weird watching any Spielberg movie after the Fabelmans. Like,
yeah,
I've been watching the Indiana Jones movies as well, and it's just like, yep, I still see so much. Like, it's going to be kind of impossible to not watch a Spielberg movie and not think of like elements of the Fabelmans. Even like, I don't know, I'm gonna watch 1941. It's like, yep, Sammy Fabelman made this. That makes sense.
God, I'm gonna revisit Always. Maybe it's a secret masterpiece.
Have you seen all the Spielberg movies?
I have. I've seen all his movies.
Yeah, it's interesting going to some of those ones where like they are clearly like not beloved. Like Always in 1941 are the big ones to make jokes about.
Yeah.
But even when you watch like lesser, like Empire of the Sun's a great example of that to me, where it's like not top tier Spielberg, but still like any director would kill to make a movie this good.
Absolutely, yeah.
Kind of thing. It's all right for Spielberg.
Yeah. Always in 1941, I think are his worst movies in my opinion.
I mean, my least favorite is War Horse.
Yeah, that's down there. I will say I've been thinking about watching it again. Part of me is like, well, it's it's a late era Spielberg shot by Janusz Kaminski. Like it can't, at least it'll look good.
And then there are other ones that I just find like I don't know if I'd be curious to revisit, even though I just have the weird sort of fan culture thing around like a Ready Player One.
I think that movie's good, and that's
okay.
Yeah,
to be fair, I have the sting of I read the novel and it's one of the worst books I've ever read.
Yeah, I've read
genuinely.
I've read pieces of the book and I'm like, this is terrible. But I think what Spielberg does with that movie is super interesting.
We may talk about it someday. Put a pin in that. Who knows? We could talk about any Spielberg movie on the show at some point.
Oh man,
who knows?
Let's talk Tintin.
It's just Tintin fucking rules.
God, yeah.
Tintin's so massively underrated. But you know what? Let's talk a bit about this sort of. Is there anything else about the movie that we haven't mentioned you want to shout out? Because I want to kind of talk about the fallout of the movie to kind of close us off. But any final things about the movie itself we haven't mentioned you want to shout out?
Not really. I mean, we mentioned the scene where they all like compare their scars. A great guys being dudes scene.
Show Me the Way to Go Home. Little musical number that happens and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I will. I mean, I guess we should touch on maybe the ending of the movie.
Yes, I think we, especially with the factor of the real shark footage that shows up in here, which is fascinating. Where there was a point early on, like I think the first stuff ever shot for the movie was shot by like an Australian couple, who were like shark experts, and all the stuff that's like Quint in the cage, not like the close-ups, but like the wide shots of like Quint in the cage, where it's like a very small cage and there's like a little person in there as a double, and you have like an actual like giant shark come up. And it looks bigger because of the scale thing, where it's a smaller cage, a smaller person in there. And then the shark literally got caught in the top rope and like nearly capsized the boat that was attached to. And it's like that shot where it's like the shark on top of the cage and like rolling around.
Yeah, it's a
basically
really
causing it to fall
terrifying
over.
shot.
Yep, especially because it's an actual shark who's just like in terror of like, oh my god, what's happening? I don't know, I'm trapped in here. That shot does such a great job where like it feels like it fits perfectly in that movie because it's another great example of the editing from Spielberg and Verna Fields, where it's like we just see enough of that to where it adds more like realism to the shark to some degree, but also just adds the other unreal layer of like, oh my god, this shark's like fucking destroying this boat.
Yeah, I really quick, I also love when Hooper is trying to get Brody to go to the front of the boat to take a picture, and he's like, I need you in the picture for scale.
Yes. But that leads into like all the stuff where, Quint dies and the boat is capsizing and Hooper's down at the bottom, which was not also a part of the original script because of like that realistic shark footage they shot in Australia. Originally, it was going to be that Hooper, as he does in the book, he dies while he's in that cage and gets like mauled to death by the shark. But because like the shot they got was like of the cage being empty, they had Hooper just like escape briefly, and so he survives the movie. I think a wise change, I would say.
Yeah.
I think it works to have like the two of them just barely survive by the skin of their teeth. And then, you got the air pressure tanks that we got exposition for coming into play, and, Smile, you son of a bitch, and the explosion and everything, and the two of them heading out to water. I think it's just hot take, great movie, perfect ending.
Yeah, I always forget that it literally like is explosion, cut to them like swimming to shore using the barrels, and then the movie ends. Like no messing about. We're done. It's the movie. Go home. It's great. It's a great ending.
Yeah, and like the only sort of like coda you get, the epilogue, is if you watch through the whole credits, you see Hooper and Brody go onto shore.
Oh really? Oh, that's cool. I never noticed that.
Yeah, that's the thing is if you stick around for the credits, there's an Easter egg there where the
post-credit scene.
Post-credit scene. And then Quint shows up with an eye patch, just like, here to tell you about the Jaws initiative. But yeah, so movie ends there. Massive success. Made $476.5 million in 1975, which is...
That's a lot of money. The highest grossing movie at the time, I'm assuming?
Yeah, and then, Steve's buddy George had to make his big space
Yeah, a
movie.
couple years later, a little movie
Usurper.
called Star Wars comes out.
To kind of close this out in terms of the movie discussion, how do you feel, like, not just with, everyone says this created the summer blockbuster was, like, so influential with, like, all the references and stuff. What about just, like, on a more of, like, a structural level and even, like, in terms of, like, overall, like, sort of ripple effects? How do you see the influence of Jaws still affecting, especially bigger blockbusters today?
I don't know much about kind of, I guess, its ripple effect, because I would say we're so far removed from this type of blockbuster, like today we are at least. But watching it, like, it's a great, like, movie. Like, structurally, like, the first hour and some change flies by, and then you're on the boat already. A lot of the lessons taken from this movie have not taken the right lessons, maybe. But I'm not sure. How do you feel about it?
Well, I do agree that I don't think it's necessarily as big in, like, the traditional kind of, like, big action-y blockbuster. I don't think you see that as much now, except for, I think, some of the basic things where it's like, we have to raise the stakes, we have to have, like, this kind of attack or, like, big scene happen at this point in the story, this kind of thing. Structurally, I think that's still, like, the bones are still kind of affecting modern blockbusters. But I think the bigger influence you see is in a lot of horror films, quite frankly.
Sure.
Even ones that aren't technically, like, big budget necessarily, but, like, every single shark movie that's come out after this has to contend with the idea of, like, we're doing another shark movie in the wake of Jaws.
Yeah.
How can we possibly work around that? And I think a lot of the movies where they have had sharks, the more successful ones with, like, sort of shark creatures in it, have kind of, like, taken certain lessons from Jaws, but also know when to, like, do something a bit different. Like, I would say the most successful one to me is something like The Shallows.
Yeah,
the Blake
first one
Lively
I thought
remake.
of. Mm-hmm.
Right, which I think is, like, a great example of, like, we have, like, the economics of it. We have one character stuck on this rock, and all, like, the dangers and the upsetting things that happen, like, the limitations that put her at unease with, like, this big giant shark, which is CG, but you don't see it a lot. And I think they reserve whenever they do show the shark off in that movie, and it works. Or even my favorite example, and it's not a shark movie, but I think it's another sea creature attacking movie, Alexandra Aja's Crawl.
Oh, sure.
Fucking rips.
A great movie.
If anyone has not seen Crawl, fucking great, awesome movie that still has a lot of the tension and also establishes like its environment pretty well and its characters in a really decent way. And yeah, I think that's the thing, is you see it more in kind of like these lower budget horror movies that are able to like kind of take certain influences from Jaws, but at the same time aren't aiming to be like massive crowd pleasers, because Jaws knew like it wasn't trying to appeal to like a 4-quadrant audience. It's just, let's tell this great story about this shark and these people that are trying to kill it. And I think that's the thing, is like a horror movie knows like a niche that it kind of is trying to fit. So they know like, okay, we can take an influence from a Jaws in a way that fits what we're trying to aim for, but also do our own thing. And I think that's more of the influence you see. Or you could go the other way and do something like a movie I kind of recommend and I saw recently. Are you aware of what Cruel Jaws is?
No, I saw that you had like watched it though. What the fuck is this?
Okay. Very briefly tangent on Cruel Jaws. Cruel Jaws is a movie from Bruno Mattei, who is a famous schlocky Italian filmmaker, who was infamous for making movies that were ripoffs of other movies, but also had literal footage stolen from these movies. And in Cruel Jaws, it's about this like seaside Florida environment. It was shot in Florida as well, but like sort of water park area where like this dad who looks exactly like Hulk Hogan and his daughter who just lost the use of her legs in a car accident are trying to save their water park with like dolphins and sea otters and shit like that from a big land developer guy who's trying to destroy it to make a hotel. And there's a shark attack that's going on at the same time and all of this. There are literal points where Bruno Mattei cuts in bits of Jaws. Like they show at least 3 seconds of like the leg falling at one point. I'm surprised I was able to see this on Tubi, because like this feels like a movie that I believe had like various legal problems that prevented it from getting like home releases for a while and shit like that. But that's a movie where they're like, you know what, we're gonna do a shameless Jaws ripoff with our complete lack of money and make an incredibly funny so bad it's good movie. Like there are so many points where we talked about the editing in this. There are many points where like a scene will be happening and a minute before it should cut away, it cuts, and then we're at a completely different scene. Like, whoa, what's happening? Wait, a guy just got attacked by a shark, and within 3 frames, we're at like the sea park area. It's like, what? Wait, what are we doing? This makes no sense. Would kind of recommend Cruel Jaws as like the fun example of a bad attempt to rip off Jaws.
Right.
And the biggest indicator of its lasting quality as a major film, Cruel Jaws, wonderful film. But you know, let's go ahead, and we talked about this movie for so long, Brian. Let's go ahead and do our weekly segment we'll be doing called Between the Lines. So Between the Lines is a segment where Brian and I will recommend another film that sort of fits alongside the movie we're talking about today, either as like another C for classic, sort of within the Blockbuster thing, or just something related to Jaws in some way. So I'll start off here, and my recommendation is another one that I would argue would fit for C for classic. Blockbuster came out in 1978, and it is the original Superman the movie from director Richard Donner. Now, the main reason I wanted to recommend this was maybe sort of related to a recent superhero movie. We've seen many superhero movies in the last several years, but you know, there was one fairly recently that decided to have a cameo long posthumously from Christopher Reeve that deeply upset me.
Oh boy.
And I was like, you know what? I don't want to. I hate that this is like the lasting legacy of Christopher Reeve Superman. It's like, oh, we have him as a cameo in our big multiverse story. And spoilers, The Flash. I'm sorry. If you're one of the 5 people who didn't go see The Flash because you were interested but you couldn't go, or more likely, the amount of people who didn't give a shit and made that movie bomb horribly. There's a cameo from Christopher Reeve Superman in very bad, like, deep fake CG stuff that's just so upsetting to see. And it's a bummer because when you go back to the original Superman, especially in an age of, like, modern superhero movies, and you go back to that, which wasn't the first superhero movie, but was, like, the sort of first in, like, a near-modern age.
Right.
You forget how, like, they treat the origin story of Superman like a Greek myth. Amazing, incredibly beautiful story that goes like through like the whole origin. It feels so much like, oh, this is like the story of Moses. This is the 10 Commandments, but it's about a guy from a fictional planet who came down and has superpowers. And Donner treats it with like that amount of sincerity, but also enough like charm to where when Christopher Reeve gets to be like the charming Superman character, you're instantly just like, I love this guy. I want to see this guy save as many people as possible. He seems like a great dude who I would love to be around. And then the mixing of like Margot Kidder, Lois Lane, and all this stuff. I think the movie is 80% a masterpiece. I think once it gets to like the sort of ending bit where you got like the Gene Hackman kind of like I'm destroying the world kind of element happen and becomes like a 70s disaster movie, it's not quite as interesting to me at that point, but it's more than enough for like that first, I don't know, like hour and like 50 minutes of time where it's like kind of a masterpiece still. And even though it's not my favorite Superman movie, I would say I'm one of those weirdos where my favorite Superman movie is the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. The not quite complete version of that movie that got taken away from him, I think, is like a near perfect Superman movie to me. But I think the original Superman still rules, still rocks, and especially if you're so cynical about modern superhero movies like a lot of people are, this one, you know, it might be worth a revisit to remember when this kind of felt magical.
Yeah, God, I watched it for the first time like last year, I think. It's a long movie. Like the origin story is so long. I think Christopher Reeve as like Clark Kent Superman is one of the best performances in any comic book movie ever. Or there's the scene where he like is talking to Lois Lane and he like is Superman and Clark Kent. He like, you know, goes outside to the apartment and does yeah, I think his performance is so great.
Yeah, and I'll shout out another great John Williams score. That
Yes,
theme
oh my gosh.
fucking honks.
Incredible.
It rules.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Gene Hackman, amazing also.
Gene Hackman,
Lex Luthor.
Ned Beatty. So funny in that movie.
Yes, rules. But what about, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, so I wanted to do another early Spielberg since I've been watching a few of them, and I went with a 1971 movie he made, a TV movie he made called Duel, which I guess is part of his kind of like, you know, he's at Universal making TV stuff, gets to make a TV movie, and it's a movie starring Dennis Weaver, and he's a guy who he's driving like home from somewhere, goes on the highway. There's a great opening scene where you see him go from like his house in the suburbs to into the city to like rural, almost like it looks like Arizona, like it's in the desert. And he has this like strange interaction with like a semi truck, like a Peterbilt, like huge like tanker truck. And then the truck tries to kill him. It has so many of the like horror infused sensibilities that Spielberg had early on that you see in Jaws. The way it's shot, you see a lot of his taste kind of start to really form. Like, for example, the sort of very first shot of this giant truck is like it pans from the back wheels all the way to the right, and it creates this really imposing image of this huge truck. But it also is just a short, fun movie. It's thrilling, and it's great to see Spielberg, you know, very early on sort of establishing himself already as a really great filmmaker, because I think the movie like is really great. I know it like previously was not available for like a while, but I think now has become a lot more available. I like rented it on like iTunes. But yeah, that's my recommendation.
I saw Duel originally in college, and I thought like, oh, this is an interesting kind of like early Spielberg morsel that's fascinating. I rewatched it for the first time in a while, right before I watched Jaws this time. It's like, it's been like, I don't know, over a decade. I'm curious to rewatch it. And yeah, I think Duel is just so fascinating, especially considering it was originally presented as a TV movie, and then it was expanded for theaters like internationally. Like in Europe, it was in theaters and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff that was like added in to give a bit more context. Like the whole scene where he calls his wife was not in the original TV airing.
Oh, interesting.
And it's for the theatrical version. Yeah, it is fascinating to watch that, considering like all the Jaws stuff, where like all of the, you know, the road chases that are going on, the fact that this giant truck doesn't have like any real humanity in it. You only see like little bits and pieces of the guy who's driving and stuff like that. It shows, even at that stage when he had not made a theatrical movie, that like just this kid gets it.
Yeah,
this kid's got moxie.
He'll move the camera around a scene so well, and he knows exactly like where to frame things and how to move certain actors so that they'll be in this exact, you know, part of the frame. It's incredible. And yeah, you get so much of that. And the car chases are like genuinely like thrilling to watch, like still to this day.
Yep, and the big Jaws connection, when the shark blows up in Jaws, you hear a brief sort of faint, almost roar, which is a bit of sound design taken directly from Duel, when the car also like falls to its death.
Oh.
There's a bit of like that sound connection. That's where I first even heard what Duel was like him referencing that, like, oh, in the documentary I was talking about, like, oh, this is a callback to Duel. I'm like, what's Duel? I'm like 10. I don't know what this is. Who's Dennis Weaver? But yeah, I would definitely recommend, if you have not seen Duel out there, it's a crucial piece of early Spielberg.
It is, yeah.
That kind of like, it's another great example of like, oh, you even see the ripple effects to Jaws and everything else afterward, if you watch that one. But yeah, just to briefly repeat our titles for everybody out there, I recommended Superman the movie, and Brian recommended Duel. But yeah, let's go ahead and do our outro here, wrapping up this first episode. We want to thank some people. Like, we want to thank Burial Grid for our intro and outro music. Purchase their music over at burialgrid.com. And thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. You can find her on Twitter at MishKyle96. That's MICHKYLE 96. And shout, I love the artwork. I commissioned this on a whim recently from her, and I'm like, hey, can you make this work? And yeah, she did a tremendous job with it, and I'm very happy with it.
Yeah, it's a great artwork.
And also, we want to thank our supporters over on Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter. That's cinema number 2 letter. All of you who are from the Double Edge Double Bill show are now staying over, and we appreciate those who stayed, and anyone who wants to join back up now that we started, or wants to join for the first time. There's so much content. All the Double Edge Double Bill content is still going to be up there from the past, but we've recorded some recent stuff over there, where the plan is over on the Patreon for just $1. If you subscribe for that, you get access to bonus content, including polls where you get to vote for at least one movie per miniseries. Like, this particular episode was chosen by the patrons, who picked between Star Wars and Jaws. We end up with Jaws. We'll talk about Star Wars some other day. We could do a whole mini-series devoted to Star Wars if we wanted to.
We could.
Especially in this modern internet climate. It'd be perfect. Everyone will love all of our opinions about Star Wars. You can vote for polls like that, or you can also listen to bonus audio stuff that we do. We plan on doing at least one big bonus episode a month. We're still in the planning stages on what the big one's going to be. We're thinking of maybe a top 10 list. Still kind of work out what the topic of that will be specifically. But we have released a couple of audio reviews at the time this has come out, where we've talked about very recent releases, where we did Across the Spider-Verse fairly recently. And in the time that this has come out, we would have also put out one for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. We haven't seen it as of this recording.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I don't know. By the time this comes out, you all would have heard our either incredible surprise or disappointment. You'll be able to hear that for just the $1. And it really helps out the show. Any of that money goes toward making the show better and making, helping the show run and continue to be. So we appreciate everyone that contributes that $1. And for more of us, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Cinema2letter. Once again, I'm changed all of the different socials to that Cinema2letter. Number 2 letter, and you can follow us there for like updates and various different little bits and pieces. And you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at NotTheWho'sTommy. And you also do some writing over at marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com.
And yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm sure we'll have it linked in the description. My handle is my name, Brian, Bryan, and then DRADE, and then the number 3. So that's my @ on Twitter, and then at my Letterboxd is just my name. So Brian Andrade, ANDRADE. Yeah, follow me on there.
And for more of us, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, our great podcast network, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on here? You can also dig into the archives on our Podbean main feed for like most of the Double Edge Double Bill stuff is going to still be up there. You can find all of that, but you'll also be able to hear all the future episodes of Cinema to the Letter over there. It still is under the Double Edge Double Bill .podbean.com thing, just because I didn't want to fuck with our RSS feed for anybody else out there. We'll call this Double H Double Bill Production, roughly, I guess, with cinema to the letter. That's the one thing that hasn't changed. But if you want to help us out, you can just rate, review, or simply share the show around. Gets us more visibility. You don't have to spend like $1 on the Patreon, we understand. If you just share the show around, if you like it, tell people about it, really appreciate it. Gets us more sort of word in the algorithms and keeps us away from being shark bait, as it were.
Hoo-ha-ha.
Yes, another movie clearly influenced with a shark named Bruce.
Yeah.
That blew my fucking mind when I was a kid, when I realized, like, oh, that's a Jaws reference. That makes so much sense.
You know what, now that I think about it, that's probably the first I ever saw like anything of Jaws, was probably Finding Nemo.
Right, when the reference there, true. Makes sense. But, you know, we're at the end of the show here, Brian, so we should just tease what our next episode's going to be. Next episode, we kind of mentioned it earlier, in terms of like the rundown, what we were doing. But next time, we'll be doing our Eye for Indie, an indie blockbuster, where we'll be talking about the Blair Witch Project from 1999, which I know, Brian, is a favorite of yours.
Yes, one of my favorite movies of all time. Also one of the only movies I find genuinely terrifying, so it's going to be very interesting to rewatch this. But I'm excited to talk about it. I got a lot of thoughts on this movie.
Yeah, I have a very interesting kind of background with this movie as well. But until then, everybody, it's time to say farewell and adieu to ye fair Spanish ladies.